Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Crowdsourcing Sustainability podcast. My name is Rachel Taylor, and I'm the community weaver here at Crowdsourcing Sustainability, and I will be your host alongside Ryan Hagan, our founder and director. And today we are so excited to be talking to Jessyn Farrell. And Jessyn is a longtime climate and economic justice advocate. She's a former Washington state legislator. She is a former executive director of the Transportation Choices Coalition, and she's currently serving as the director of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment. And I have personally had the pleasure of getting to work with Jessyn when she was senior vice president at Civic Ventures, a progressive economic policy shop. And she's really one of the smartest and most dedicated and down-to-earth people that I know. So I'm so excited for you all to get to hear from her today. So thank you, Jessyn, so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So we always kind of like to start our conversations by asking our guests about their climate story. When did you first, become aware of climate change, start caring about it, and kind of what has your climate journey been and your path been through this landscape of the climate and sustainability world?
Okay, great. So I grew up in the Seattle area, and my kind of personal joke is that I started out as a Save the Whales kind of environmentalist. There are actually orcas in Puget Sound, and sometimes you get to see them, and it's totally magical. It's an amazing thing to live in a place where these big, huge, awesome whales are there. And I initially went into transit advocacy because I felt like making cities great places to live is a great way to save our wild places. And transit kind of runs through so many different things, whether it is your time, economic justice, who has access to transit and where transit goes, getting people to their jobs, definitely climate. And so I really got into environmental advocacy and climate advocacy through transit, because in Washington state, transportation was and continues to be the biggest cause of climate emissions. And, the best and easiest way to reduce climate emissions right now is for people to get out of their cars and walk and bike and take transit. And so I worked as a transit advocate running Transportation Choices Coalition, as you talked about, advocating for big, massive regional investments in light rail. But climate didn't really become the frame for a lot of my work until, kind of 2006, 2007. And we were very, very optimistic that suddenly we were going to just start using climate as a lens to make transportation investments. And then the Great Recession hit, and the governor at the time pulled the plug on a lot of the efforts that were happening, and everything got reoriented towards, kind of recession style budgetary politics. And it was a really good example of where economics and economic hardship and the way budgets are perceived runs headlong into environmental policy. And so it was just one of those moments where politicians really prioritize things over climate. And so while it seemed exciting at the moment, suddenly everything took a hard turn and we lost a lot of years. So that's a little bit about my background on climate advocacy.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Sorry, I'm pausing. My mind's going to perceived budgetary and the economics of that, which is a whole nother conversation, which we might have to have later.
Yeah.
So we are digging into community climate action this month and how to advocate for that action at the local level in our newsletter and in our online community. And as a former state legislator and someone who has worked in local politics, can you share how you think about climate planning and community climate action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, the first order is that climate change is happening right now, and it's impacting people in their lives every day. And it's impacting people who experience racial injustice, economic injustice, and And so really focusing on community members and their solutions and their experience of climate change is really important, because people understand their own neighborhoods, their own lives best. And the Office of Sustainability and Environment in the city of Seattle is really focused on advancing environmental justice. And central to that is that people are agents in their lives, in their own lives. And Black, Indigenous, people of color are really central to our policymaking and drive, quite frankly, a lot of the work that we do. And so the work we do is very iterative with community members, and priorities are often sourced by community members, and how we implement those priorities is really iterative and in dialogue with community members. So I mean, at its very basic, like local government and local politics at its best, sometimes local government institutions are really lousy at being conduits for environmental justice-based action, but we really try to center and focus our work on advancing a clean and healthy environment. But part of that is around decision-making and listening and that agency piece.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I feel like you set us up perfectly for the next question too, because you're, pointing to the need to, not only lessen the gap between, the communities that governments are supposed to be serving and those governments, but to actually like weave them together, in the policymaking process. And, I think it's easy for people to feel like politicians, even local ones, are kind of out of their reach, or that, as a citizen or like a normal person, right, you don't have any influence or decision-making power. And so what do you feel like are the most effective ways for those regular people to influence their local politicians? Like, I mean, I'm hearing you talk about, at least in Seattle, the government is actively, reaching out to communities and asking them to participate in the process, which is fantastic. But for folks who, maybe that's not happening in their community, how can they influence their local politicians, and how does it work kind of behind the scenes when you're receiving feedback from citizens, and how important is that?
Well, I'm going to go way upstream and just start by saying, if you don't feel like your values are being represented, and like being in office really matters, and who is in office really matters, and background and experience and identity really does matter, and drives values, and drives whether someone is wanting to engage with community members or not. So, one part of the answer definitely is running for office and being in office and being at the table is something that's really important to that. I think another thing is being able to, again, I say this, there are a lot of barriers to showing up in the process, whether it's like what time meetings are, the location of meetings, the language meetings are in, whether there is childcare. So I say this knowing that there are a lot of barriers to be able to come and participate, but I really do think that having presence in the local, in decision-making is a really important part. Organizing around your neighborhood and talking to your neighbors and coming up with priorities that are then communicated, that really matters. I mean, there's just another, of course, thing that we know and really does matter is collective organizing. There's strength in numbers. And when people are able to advocate with one voice, or maybe not one voice, but like a general, it's okay to have, a coalition that has a lot of different pieces to it. I think good coalitions actually do. But being able to show up with numbers and a general alignment around what it is that you're asking for, that really matters. And that drives, I think, outcomes and decision-making.
That's great. I mean, as you're saying that too, after naming so many of those barriers, I guess that also makes me think that like that kind of neighborhood organizing can also be a way to address some of those barriers, right? Like if you're organizing with your neighbors and, you can't go at this time, but another neighbor can, or, one neighbor can provide the childcare while the other neighbors go to the meeting, it's like, it can also be a way to, just crowdsource the resources that you need in order to meet the barriers that you're facing, which just feels like a wonderful community solution.
Yeah, that's right on. When I was in the legislature, I was the first Democratic woman in 25 years to have a baby. And that says a lot about the demographics, although it's changed a lot. There are a lot more people with kids in the legislature, in the Washington state legislature, than there were. And, my office became a place where people who were coming to lobby legislators, like, community members who were coming to lobby legislators could come. A woman could use my office to breastfeed. You could come hang out with your kids because, it isn't really set up, especially a decade ago, was not set up as a place that was very child friendly. So I do think that, figuring out how to show up with kids really matters. And, again, using neighbors and that kind of collective working together is really important.
I love those examples. I want to follow up on one piece of that question because there's a lot of pieces to it. But behind the scenes, how is this advocacy received by local politicians in your experience? Any examples that come to mind of what people might not know of the ripple effect of what they're doing?
Yeah, I think, again, backing up, as a advocate, and an organizer in my previous world as in transit, a lot of what we spent our time doing was a couple of different things. One, we thought a lot about narrative and how to tell a story of transit that engages people and allows people to see it as an issue that matters to them, right? Not everybody takes transit, especially in different places, in a city like Seattle and in Seattle suburbs. That's changed a lot over the last 15 years, but it's definitely been a movement. So I think really thinking about the story of transit and how that impacts people's lives. And then I do think, again, showing up and creating space for people to come together. People are social. And so creating space for people to come together and learn, come together and talk about issues, and then have an opportunity to take action. And again, there are all kinds of ways to do that, from doorbelling to leafleting a parking lot to, all the different ways that we connect in person and engage online. And then, yeah, exactly, thinking of the specific ask and showing up in the various, decision-making points. And it really matters. I will say, the reason lobbyists are so well paid is it actually matters to show up and say the thing that, that you want to have happen or not have happen. And so behind the scenes, the big fossil fuel lobbyists are in the legislature 24/7, are at the city council 24/7. Why? Because having a presence actually does matter. And so again, it's a lot harder for regular people because people work, they have kids, they have all kinds of obligations. But really that actual physical presence and that being there to talk and ask and tell stories really makes a difference. That's why lobbyists are paid to do that. That's how it goes.
That's super helpful. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd love to dig in a little more about your decision to run for office. I think this is another thing that can feel out of reach for a lot of people. So how did you come to that decision? What was it like running for office? And do you have any words of advice for folks who might be thinking about it, but are a little intimidated?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I was that super weird kid who was voted most likely to be a politician in high school. I was really civically engaged and definitely wanted to do that. But like, I think a lot of women, I felt like I had to credential myself first, and that I couldn't just like show up and run for office. I needed to go to law school and have a career and, you know, be an advocate and learn the political system, work on campaigns, you know, just that sense of like, I needed, experience and credentials before I could jump in. But in getting experience and credentials, I spent time in Olympia, which is where the state legislature is in Washington, lobbying a lot of men my age. At that time, I was in my late 20s and early 30s. And it really just dawned on me, like, why are there no young women in the legislature? And so in 2012, I decided to run, and there were literally no women with little kids. And so I decided to run in 2012, in part because there was like nobody representing the viewpoint of a mother with two small children. And again, that earlier point I made, like, if you feel like your values aren't being represented, that's because you're not there to represent them. And so that was what really compelled me. It was like a little bit of a sense of competition, like, why are the men here, the young men here, and the young women are not? And it was definitely, you know, in some ways not an easy decision. It was not convenient. I got a lot of questions like, who's going to take care of your kids? Well, you know, like maybe my husband might, or, you know, my parents, or like, my kids will get taken care of. Don't worry about it. And I know my male colleagues did not get asked that question. So those are some of the things that led up to my deciding to run in 2012 originally.
Awesome. I love that. And like, can you tell us a little bit more about like, what was it like running for office? And do you have any advice for, people who are thinking about it, but feel overwhelmed, or even people who, you know, this might be the first time hearing us have this conversation that they're like, oh, I could run for office. Like, any advice or?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, first of all, like actually running for office in some ways is pretty low barrier. Like you just have to know when you file, you have to have the filing fee, you know, so in some ways, like it's really possible to go do it, but it is something where it's going to take a lot of time. It takes a lot of being willing to ask for money. I had done a lot of asking for money in my job before as a nonprofit director, but it is really different to ask for money for yourself than it is to ask for money for an issue. And you really have to kind of move through a process to feel comfortable, like saying, you friend or you stranger should invest in me because this is what I bring to the table. And like, that's hard. And one of the best ways to do it is to practice. There are lots of great support networks for different, you know, for women, for BIPOC folks, for, you know, different issue areas. And so if you're thinking about it, like actually taking a training or becoming part of a network of people that's interested in trying this out is really helpful, because you get trained in some of these things that are really hard, that could feel hard if you've never done them before. You know, like, how do you select a campaign consultant? How do you know, like, there are all these just nuts and bolts of how you actually run a campaign. And so I might recommend either volunteering for someone or joining one of these, you know, networks of support as a way to kind of get assimilated or familiar with how campaigns work. So those are a couple of ideas. And so then, so I mean, running in 2012, and then of course I ran for mayor 2 times, mayor of Seattle in 2017 and 2021. You know, I mean, for me as a person with kids, like I just had to bring my kids to everything because you know, it's hard to organize childcare around a campaign schedule. You're at events morning till night. It's hard to balance being able to do all of the things that are demanding a campaign, from fundraising to doing endorsement interviews with stakeholders to doorbelling to managing a job. A lot of people have to work. I had a job in 2012, you know, so So one of the ways I dealt with it was just to say, okay, my kids are going to come, they're going to doorbell with me, they're going to come to events with me. And, it may not be the most efficient day of doorbelling because they're tired and cranky and hot, but that's how it's going to work, So I think really being willing to run a campaign based on where you are in your own personal life is kind of really important. And that authenticity and that willingness to just be yourself as you are. And people respond to that. Like, people hate slick politicians, right? Like, we're so over that. So being able to just be yourself where you are in that moment of your life really connects, I think, with people.
Yeah, that's great. I love that perspective, because I also feels like it connects back so beautifully to what you're talking about, we need more diverse values and backgrounds and experiences represented in government. And there's no reason, just like there's no one way to be in office. There's no one way to run for office either. Like, you can do it as yourself with your experiences, and that's, just opens the whole thing up.
And I think one other thing, running for office is really hard. And I talked a little bit about how I constantly got asked, who's going to take care of my kids? Even when I ran for mayor in 2017 and 2021, I mean, being mayor of a big city is a 24/7 job. And there were definitely people like, well, how are you going to take a call in the middle of the night? Who's going to take care of your kids? So there are really entrenched biases and prejudices dependent on how we show up in the world based on race, class, gender, all of those different things. And it is really important to have, a kitchen cabinet of people who love you for who you are and can kind of be that group of people that has your back no matter what, because being in public life is really hard. It's only getting harder. We're in a polarized time. Trump, has really made it okay to be a white supremacist, right? So there is just a lot of stuff that someone who's running for office is going to get. And I just think it's really important to have a group of people that you trust, that are all about you, and that really you can turn to in those moments where it just gets too hard, because sometimes it is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine it just in the age of the internet as well, like all of the ways that people have to have access to you, or just to have some good boundaries and that kitchen cabinet of people also willing to help you enforce those boundaries, I would imagine is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So pivoting a little bit back to kind of policy, you've had some really impressive success pushing equitable and sustainable transit policy forward in Washington and Seattle. You were, helped to get 25 billion with a B in investment for bus, bike, rail, and pedestrian transport in Washington. And that's a huge investment in equitable climate policy. And, again, I was kind of laughing as we were writing this interview, because I was like, Jessyn's the one who does all the things that feel out of reach to most people. So I feel like a lot of these questions are again, I think the policy process can feel really obscure to people and far away, and they don't know how it works, and it happens behind closed doors, right? And so, having been so involved in some really big policy initiatives, can you tell us a little bit about what that process is actually like? Who's writing the policy? Who are the stakeholders? How does kind of, a big city or statewide sustainability policy like that transportation investment get passed, and what kind of makes or breaks that process?
Okay, those are great questions. They're really big. Generally, social movements are big and diverse, and there are a lot of different approaches. So I just really want to acknowledge that there are a lot of different ways to get social change done, and we need all of the ways. And lots of people pushing and pressing and engaging in their special way is so important. So my particular small little, way of engaging. First of all, like I have been so lucky in my career to get to work with amazing teams of people. At Transportation Choices Coalition, we were a small team of 5 people, but it was really important to have this amazing kind of esprit de corps and support and working together and building out, the coalition part of our name. Same thing at the Office of Sustainability and Environment. I'm in one of those moments in my career where I get to work with the most amazing group of almost 40 people that are just so smart and talented and passionate and community focused. And, so like that really matters, like getting to be around people that inspire you and help you be your best self is really great. And so I just have to like start by saying how important it is to me to be a part of a team. And then I think the second thing, like this is a little esoteric, but I'm just going to kind of go there. When I was a kid, I got to be a part of a really amazing public education system that focused on jazz and music education in Seattle. And I mean, Rachel, you know this. Like you come from Port Townsend, where there's this amazing jazz festival. And so like there's this long-standing culture of kids getting to learn how to play jazz at a really amazing level from amazing musicians. And I had access to that. And one of the things that you learn as a jazz musician is really how to listen and how to not be afraid of like putting yourself out there, and then how to listen again, right? Because so much of jazz is that like dance of like putting something out and listening and creating and listening again and coming up with something new. I mean, that's what improvising is, right? And so my belief around public policy is that it's a really similar process, like listening and then putting something out there and then listening again and creating something new that maybe is a way to get at our disparate interests. So like that is always something that is just really important to me. And again, that gets back to this idea of environmental justice and like fundamentally, especially me as a government person, having a stance of listening and being willing to iterate and change and make something new, because our systems are built on racial oppression and economic oppression. And so we're in this moment of what does this new set of systems look like that value truly people and that rectify and change systems that have hurt and harmed and traumatized people since the inception of the country. And so that is something that really inspires me. And again, I'm being a little more esoteric, but I do think that some of those things just around listening and receiving are really important skills and orientations to coming into public policy work. And that's how you build the broad-based movements to be able to do big things around change. Because that's why we're in the business, right? To change.
That's super helpful. I'm gonna zoom in on one piece of that, which is how the policy actually gets written.
Okay.
Just so like I have a sense and people listening have a sense, is it typically, because I hear for DC that like a lot of times like lobbyists or, nonprofits, whatever, end up writing certain policy. Does that happen at the state level as well? Or like, is it, I guess, just who's writing it and how is that process influenced specifically?
Okay, good. I'll do 2 examples. One, I'm going to talk about, so we are trying to electrify everything in the city of Seattle very quickly because the climate crisis is upon us and the hour is late and we have dilly-dallied for like a really long time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project we're doing to electrify drayage trucks. And then I can talk about, some of the backroom deals in the legislature. So, because the legislature in a lot of states, the legislature is not where the population centers are. It's like hard to get there. It's like this very limited time period. So we'll talk a little bit about the legislature, but I want to talk about drayage trucks for a minute first. So drayage trucks are those trucks that basically move short the kind of short trips moving containers to logistics facilities from the port to, logistics facility. And a lot of times neighborhoods that are right next to port also happen to be those communities that have experienced racial injustice, environmental harm, economic injustice. And it's no coincidence that there are, dirty, stinky trucks driving through, spewing out lots of particulates and impacting people's health and well-being. And in the Seattle area, a neighborhood called South Park is really impacted by port impacts and drayage truck impacts. And so over many, 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 many years, community activists pushed the city and the port and other big actors to start to clean up the air in this neighborhood and really focusing on drayage trucks. And so over time, the city has evolved. It was not always a good actor in this neighborhood, and still has a lot of challenges in terms of how we show up and what we're doing. But one project is to figure out how to electrify drayage trucks. And drayage trucks in Seattle, there are big kind of corporate owned drayage companies, and then there are also independent contractors, a lot of whom are immigrants and refugees. And we decided to, really be in keeping with Green New Deal principles, which is about a just transition, which is about reducing fossil fuels. We decided to really focus on drayage truck drivers who are immigrants and refugees. And how do we build an incentive program that allows these folks to get access to all of these big federal incentives, city incentives that are happening. And these trucks are really expensive. We're talking like $400,000. So we've been engaged with truck drivers for the last 18 months, really trying to understand what are some of the barriers. People who, depend on a truck for a livelihood may not want to take a risk on an electric truck that doesn't have a big charging range. So, starting to get to better understand, like, what are the pressure points? Where is the skepticism? How can we actually, it's almost like a little bit of market research. And how can we create an incentive program that meets people where they are and gives people access to these trucks that they may not have access to? So that's an example of a really deeply engaged, community-facing, community-driven policymaking effort. And we're still designing it. Like, we have not yet launched the program, but we're still very much in community design. And so that's an example of where, like, community activists pushing on a big entity like the city is actually resulting in very significant policy change. So that's just a really great example. Okay, on the other hand, in Olympia and in state legislatures, in the people's legislature, I was talking about how lobbyists, or how big corporations pay lobbyists to basically be there literally all night long. And sometimes when we're trying to put together, when we were, and that's still the case, like trying to do a hard piece of legislation, negotiations can go on and on and on and on and on deep into the night. And who sticks around? Often, not the parent with kids to go home to, or the person who works the night shift, right? But the person who's paid to be there and watch out for a big moneyed interest. And literally, like, sitting outside the doors all night long, or sitting in the gallery all night long watching us, so there definitely is, that is a real example of where there are barriers to regular people being able to show up. Because if you have obligations at home, and by the way, your home is several hours away from the state capitol, it's really hard to show up and hold legislators accountable. So again, that's a real thing. But in terms of and so then, it's like, how do you actually write the policy? And a lot of it is that interplay of interests and what it takes to get votes. I can take an example. This is not a climate example. Is that okay? Can I give one that's not? Okay. So distracted driving is a thing. Pedestrian deaths are actually going way up, in part because we cannot put down our cell phones. As we all know, super addictive, even when we're driving. So in 2017, I introduced a bill to restrict cell phone use while driving. And guess who really hated it? Legislators. because they all were driving to Olympia from all parts of Washington, not wanting to put down their cell phones, right? Like, not only did legislators hated it, but a lot of other people had a lot of skepticism. And so, you really have to kind of meet people where you are. The best legislators are also organizers, right? Because you need to get people aligned. And one of my closest friend legislators did not like this bill. And so I had another friend legislator who was an artist draw on a piece of paper a picture of this legislator's 16-year-old son with his head hanging out the window on his cell phone out of the family car. And I left that on her desk. And that was my inroad to getting her to vote for the bill, by basically, shamelessly going through her child and being like, do you want your kid, who's just learning how to drive, on their phone and not paying attention? So that's actually an example of just like how important being able to meet people where they are. Like, legislators are people, and just like community organizing, going to really understand like what someone cares about and what that doorway is into an issue. So in some ways it's very similar. On the other hand, then you have like, the lobbyists looking over your shoulder and, there to kind of push you in certain ways or in the other. So that's a little bit about how it works. Happy to tell more war stories.
We love the dirt. We love the behind the scenes dirt. But I mean, I love what you're pointing to there too, which is like just how important human connection and relationship building is, and that there's like actually nothing that can replace that. Money's powerful for sure, but it has a really different quality of power than connection and relationship, and how you learn to skillfully make issues personal to people, people in the legislature, people in the community, whoever it is.
Yeah, that is such a great point. I mean, I think that relationships are the basic currency of change making. And it really is the same thing in the legislature and in a community and in really any decision making. Like, it really is about connecting with people where they are and finding that doorway. I think about gun violence. I think about, again, climate. Like, as people are experiencing climate more and more in their own communities, it's this opportunity to engage people in a way that maybe they didn't, care a decade ago. I think another way too is like on economics, like pocketbook. And Rachel, I know you and I have talked a lot about this in the past, but oftentimes on climate issues, we lose because the other side says doing this policy is going to raise your transportation costs, your energy costs. And in a neoliberal economy where people are really feeling a lot of economic pain, especially in this inflationary era, it is really easy to lose on economics. But we're now in this world where suddenly, we have a lot of incentives to help people actually lower their bills and have more money to put into the basic things that they need to spend their money on. And so I think the opportunity right now is to connect climate on economic issues and really help, kind of close that gap that historically has been there around climate advocacy and economic pain. But, we are in this moment where I think we can really start to make climate policy feel good economically, because it actually does. And that's super exciting to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you again for those specific examples. Those, it brings it all to life,
I can tell one final example if that's helpful.
Yeah.
It was the time I shut the legislature down. I don't know if that's a good story or not. Okay, I'll tell it. It's a little. You guys can, we'll see how it goes. So it was 2015. We were deep in negotiating a transportation package. Legislators love transportation packages. They all get to bring home lots of goodies to their district, and that is always super great. And climate played a really big role. The Republicans controlled the Senate, the Democrats controlled the House. I was in the House. and really deep fossil fuel special interests basically bullied a lot of legislators into not supporting a low carbon fuel standard. And so that got taken out of the bill literally in the middle of the night. And and there was another really big compromise that was put into the bill in the middle of the night that would basically peel off $500 million of transit funding and stick it into the general fund, which is like, funds anything in the state, whether it's prisons or schools or what have you. And I was passionately upset by those two compromises. And I had really wanted to vote for this package. I was really excited about it. I had negotiated the authorizing legislation, again, with a team. Don't want to take all the credit, but had negotiated the authorizing language for the next round of light rail investments. There was a lot of good stuff, but there were two really, really bad things in it. And I didn't want to accept either of those things. And I really didn't want to do the noble no, which is what a lot of legislators do. Like, well, I'm going to vote no. I can still go back to my constituents and be pure, but the bad things still happened. And I hated that. I did not want to be the noble no where I got the credit, but the bad things still happened. And so I basically created this big plan to put the entire transportation package to the ballot. I knew Republicans would support me on that, and I couldn't count on Democrats. So I knew I had the votes, and Republicans always love to put taxes to the voters because then they don't have to be accountable for voting for it. And so I put one amendment to put the entire $20 billion package to the voters, and another amendment to keep the transit funding intact and for the Puget Sound region. I put those amendments on the bar at the beginning of the day, and then I went and hid in the bathroom because I was about to go nuclear on this whole transportation package that everyone loved. So I hid in the bathroom while everyone, all the lobbyists, all the legislators, the governor, everyone called me the rest of the day trying to talk me out of this. And all I did was just literally hide in the bathroom, put my phone away, and sit there and see what would happen. Long story short, at the end of the day, they took my amendment. We didn't have to put it to the voters. And there's now $500 million in the Puget Sound region for vulnerable youth and homeless youth, and it's a good thing. But that's an example of how hard it can be sometimes to stick to your values. And there's a lot of social incentives in the legislature to just get along and go along. It's not incentivized to make a ruckus like that. Like we could see that with the awesome legislators in Tennessee recently. And that is a whole different story in some ways, but not totally. There's a lot of incentive to just get along. And you see that in a really distilled way in the Tennessee legislature. And it's amazing that, those three legislators stood up and said, no, we're not doing this.
Well, yeah, because it's ultimately the pressure to just get along is actually the pressure to just preserve the status quo.
Yeah.
And they're using kind of respectability politics as a shame people into not challenging the status quo and playing on, the fact that, we don't like to fight with each other and we want to be liked and all of these things. But yeah, I mean, I think, it's like you said, it's a great example of how hard it can be, but I think it's also a great example of how impactful it can be. There's now $500 million for all of these really critical programs. And that's worth a day of hiding in the bathroom.
Yeah, it is. And it's also, I think the other part of it is that creativity. I had a nuclear option, which was we're going to blow up the whole package and send it to the voters who will vote no, probably. Yeah. Or here's an amendment that allows, the Puget Sound region that was generating the taxes to keep the money. And so there's a pathway to get to yes as well. And to me, that is really important legislative politics. There are other, like I said, a social movement should have a lot of different ways of making change, and sometimes drawing lines and saying no is really important. But especially in the legislative context, creating a pathway to yes is really, really, really part of the art of getting the work done. Because the legislature and a lot of our political bodies are built, as you just said, Rachel, to like preserve the status quo, which means doing nothing. You don't have to do anything. So like, how do you create that pathway to yes? And part of it sometimes is like really just deeply creative work.
Yeah. Thanks for emphasizing that. And I mean, the other thing I hear in your story too, that, I really respect and I think is like inspiring in terms of what a politician can be is like you didn't make it about you. You made it about the people that you were there to serve and like the outcomes and the values that you were trying to get to. Like you said, you're like, I could vote a noble no and like go home and preserve my own reputation, but it's not about me. It's not about my reputation. It's about what I'm able to do for, the people who I work for, right? And I think we need more of that in politics.
Yeah. I mean, at that time, I just, I had 3 little kids. I was driving back and forth to Olympia every day. And I felt like, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to do this. So like every day has to be worth it. And that is really the work. Why are you doing it? It's for a higher purpose. It's to do all those really, truly idealistic things around making our world better. And it's hard to be idealistic in such a tough time. But it really does matter to, stay true to your values and the reason you try to do something in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. What do you see as the most important policies for people to be focused on right now to move us towards climate and justice targets? And I don't know if you have specific policies in mind, that'd be awesome, or just like specific areas that you think people should really be focused on.
So I will say this is one of those moments where we need to move everything forward on all fronts. And so I can't pick and choose, again, in Seattle, we are doing a whole bunch of things. We are introducing legislation in the next few weeks to decarbonize all of our biggest commercial buildings. That's super exciting. At the same time, we now have to turn towards like, how are we going to start to decarbonizing all of our residential homes? The Office of Sustainability and Environment has a program. We do 1,000 oil heat to electric conversions every year. Yippee, 1,000 is awesome. We have to get to 10,000 a year. Right. So like we have to go big, fast. Same thing on transportation, like we have to electrify everything. But the big sneaky trick of transportation, especially in a city like Seattle that has reasonably good walking, biking, and transit infrastructure, is we can reduce emissions right now just by leaving our cars at home and just by doing policies that reallocate pavement so that people have safe walking and biking routes near their homes. We can reallocate transit, like transit's in this really interesting moment where we were very successful in getting people out of the traditional 9-to-5 center business district commutes, but people are not necessarily doing that. So we now have this opportunity to reallocate transit service. So it's meeting people's needs who may not work in a 9-to-5 venue, but work late at night, or you're a young person. Like in Washington, we have this amazing program that now has free transit passes for all young people. Let's reorient our transit system so that it is focused on getting young people to where they need to go. And then we need to also be thinking about like the Green New Deal and how we're really rectifying economic injustice and building policies that actually create wealth and close intergenerational wealth gaps, particularly between Black families and white families, which is 10 times different in Seattle. So to me, it's like, we have to just move the ball forward on a whole bunch of different fronts. We don't have the luxury now of choosing one policy to focus on. Those days are long over. Those days never really were there.
We squandered that opportunity. Well, and part of what I hear in that's kind of, I I don't know, maybe a relief or exciting to people listening is like, that means like work on whatever you care about, work on whatever is like relevant to you and your community. And you know, the other thing is like knowing what the biggest climate contributors are, and you know, like you were saying, in Seattle and in Washington, like transportation is, you know, one of the biggest climate contributors. It might be different somewhere else it might be industrial agriculture or some, you know. And so like knowing both what the contributors are in your community, also what, you know, the risks are and the impacts are, and you can focus on like, you know, whatever feels personal and important to you, because we have to move it all.
Yeah. Although, you know what, now I did think of one. Like if I had to choose one,
okay, good.
We have to solve the housing crisis.
Yeah.
And that is really, it's a big one, and it actually has a climate impact. It has an economic impact. It has a racial justice impact. But we have a housing crisis across communities in the entire United States. And we need to unleash a lot more housing around transit in particular. But we also really need to create new financial models to create pathways to homeownership, to create access to low rents. And just in the same way, you know, 3 generations ago, we invented the fixed rate mortgage as a response to the depression and the housing crisis then, which is basically rent control for homeowners, by the way. We need the same kind of creative policy thinking and urgency to make sure that people have access to housing wealth and access to housing stability. And as we're putting in all these amazing climate investments in Seattle, we need to make sure that we're also being really careful around anti-displacement policies and being attentive to that, because we got it completely wrong when we put in light rail in Southeast Seattle and through the central area, and really perpetuated housing injustice by not focusing on gentrification and what that meant for the Black community in the central area and for other diverse communities in Southeast Seattle. So what I would say is, yes, we have to move everything forward, but the housing crisis is really big and touches a lot of different parts of the whole.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, well, we are almost at the end of our time. And we have kind of 2 potential wrap-up questions. So maybe I'll just give you the choice of which one feels the most exciting to you. And so one is just, you know, is there any kind of final call to action or like nugget of wisdom that you want to leave us with today? And the other is, what is your vision of a just and sustainable Seattle that, you know, would be real if kind of your office succeeded at every turn, or that, you know, it feels really alive in your heart?
Well, I think the vision is that every single person in our city is able to truly thrive and to have a sense of well-being and dignity, the resources to care for both yourself and for others in your community. And I think that really flows into the nugget of wisdom that I'm really trying to grow into, which is that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And it fundamentally is around creating systems of care that allow us to care for ourselves, that allow us to care for our families and our community and our, you know, beautiful, fragile planet. And so really, again, thinking about how we're creating something new in this American culture that doesn't value care, to a culture and a set of systems that really embody and value care.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I always love how you bring this spirit of creativity to the way that you talk about these things, because then it gets to become an exciting creative project that we get to do together. And I think that's really important. Jessyn, thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely wonderful to chat with you. And yeah, thanks for sharing all of your wisdom and experience and dirt with us. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.
It was great to talk to you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jessyn. This was awesome.